So does meat-only diet give us full nutritional profile? Because
Mm,
people say, okay, there's no vitamin C in, or is it not sufficient? And now we know that there is some vitamin C in meat,
mm,
but it's not sufficient. And I don't even, when it comes to the micronutrients, I don't think there is a proper guide out there that we can all follow because it depends on what else you're eating with your meat, right? And
mhm,
vitamin C is one example because it actually fights with the same receptor as glucose, and
mhm.
so you won't absorb vitamin C in the absence of glucose. So you probably will need a lot more vitamin C than if you are eating meat only. So let's talk about the nutritional profile in meat, because there are a few other nutrients which aren't available in meat. And would you be concerned about that?
No, and so the thing is depending on what you're eating, you need a different constellation of nutrients, and that's because of these nutrient blockers and disruptors and things in plants that strip out different nutrients from your body. And so if you're working against the flow, as it were, against the stream, then you're going to need some extra help, right? And so like you say with vitamin C, that's correct. If you're eating carbohydrates, that competes for binding sites with vitamin C. Vitamin C basically looks like a carbohydrate molecule with a little tail on it, and that competes for binding sites on the GLUT4 receptor with carbohydrates. And so even when it gets in, so you have to eat an abundance of vitamin C to actually get in enough absorbed. And then when that's in your system, your blood sugar is high. That's again blocking out the utilization of vitamin C as well. So it's not as well used in your body, even the little that gets in there. And then you have to ask yourself, what does vitamin C do? Well, it does a lot of things, and it's used in different processes. We find it in our macrophages and neutrophils, as well as being used to catalyze a reaction to hydrolyze proline and lysine, which are two amino acids which are used in collagen. And if they're not hydrolyzed, they won't bond tightly. You'll have these loose sort of bonds. You'll have loose connective tissue, weak connective tissue, which will start breaking down, breaking apart. You can develop atherosclerosis, and you can develop scurvy as an end result of serious vitamin C deficiency. Um, so that's not good. That's very life threatening, and that can cause disease. It can cause harm. It can cause death. But when you're eating meat, you're eating collagen and you're eating hydrolyzed proline and lysine. And so you don't actually need the vitamin C to do that. It's already done for you. So you'll make perfectly fine and adequate, strong, healthy collagen just by eating meat. You don't need vitamin C when you're eating meat, right? And so the amount of vitamin C that you need is extremely small. You don't need it at all, really, to stave off scurvy because you're making collagen perfectly well without vitamin C. But there are other processes in your body that you do need vitamin C for and can be helpful for. So um, that can be accounted for from a very small amount. So if you are eating carbohydrates and you're not eating enough meat, then you need vitamin C measured in milligrams. Varying amount, people can argue about what that is. But when you don't eat carbohydrates and you are eating meat, you need vitamin C measured in nanograms, which is 1 millionth of a milligram, right? So that is a big difference. That's a very, very big difference, right? So you need a fraction of the vitamin C. And in fact, when you look at like regeneratively raised beef that are on field rotation and just eating grass their whole life and all that sort of stuff, they actually have enough vitamin C as per the RDAs if you're eating carbohydrates. So there's plenty of vitamin C available, and you don't even need it. Other nutrients, people say, well, you need these phytonutrients. Why? What do you need? Oh, you need to eat fiber. That's where the phytonutrients are. What do you need phytonutrients for? You need phytonutrients to help break down and absorb and utilize plants. Okay, well, here's a secret. If you don't eat plants, you don't need the phytonutrients to help break down and absorb and utilize plants, right? If you don't eat the poison, you don't need the antidote, right? And so, well, we can talk about this, and we can talk about, well, you need this, you need this much of it. It's not in meat, or it's not in plants, or it's not in this, it's not in that. But again, it just comes down to functionality. right? There are people alive right now on this earth, entire civilizations, in fact, that go generation after generation only eating meat. And what do you know? They're still alive and they're still having kids, and those kids are having kids, and those kids are having kids, and so on for thousands of generations, only eating meat or nearly exclusively eating meat. And up near the North Pole, where the Inuit are, what plants are available for them to eat? Um, None. And if they wanted to eat meat, if they wanted to eat things besides meat, if they were more south in the fall and the summer and things like that, maybe that's available. But even since the New England settlement in America in the 1500s, there are accounts of people looking at the Native Alaskans, North Americans, and they were just absolutely shocked that they were just only eating meat. They would eat meat year round. And so they were like, look, I get it. This is when Canada was much colder. And so it was just inhospitable. Right. And so, people that in Canada could not be somewhere that you could colonize. So it was just a bunch of fur trappers and the Inuits, right. And the other Native Americans living around there. And so, but there were people in New England that were, interacting with these people all the time, and they were saying, there's like, look, it's snowing 9 months out of the year. Like, fine, okay, you just eat meat during that time, that's fine. But for 3 months when the snow's gone, surely they could live off the bounty of the land, as they called it, which I think was funny, and they said, but they don't for some reason. They still, even when they have access to plants, even when they could grow crops, even when they could forage for things, they still just eat meat, even in the summer, right? Okay, so you can't do that if meat doesn't have everything you need in the proportion that you need it, right? You can't do that generation after generation after generation, even if you're missing some things, like little things, or just don't have enough of some things. That only goes a few generations, and that's if you're lucky. There was an experiment with Dr. Pottinger. It's famously called Pottinger's cats, and they did this with cats, and they found that they did some surgeries on cats. They were trying to see. This guy's dad had a theory that tuberculosis, this was like the 1930s and 40s, tuberculosis was a big deal. And they had this theory that maybe tuberculosis had something to do with adrenal insufficiency or adrenal problems, or something like that. So they wanted to do an adrenalectomy on cats, expose them to TB, and see how this affected them against cats that didn't have their adrenals taken out. And so they were having these cats, and they were just feeding them, cooked meat and things like that from the kitchen, and just meat, not like this kibble garbage that we feed them now. And they found that every single cat was dying, when they were having their adrenals taken out, all of them, right? And they're like, okay, well, what the hell's going on? We can't get these damn things to live. So I have other vets and other surgeons go in, like, oh, look, the surgery was fine. The surgery was perfect. There was nothing wrong with the surgery. The cat just didn't make it. We don't know why. And then people started hearing about this. They're like, oh, these guys are taking in cats, so we're like, they just started turning in all the stray cats in their neighborhoods and things like that. And so they had more cats than they really needed. And they sort of didn't have a supply for cooked meat. It was just too much of a pain. So they just started feeding them raw meat because it was easier than cooking it for them. And all the ones that were eating cooked meat survived the surgery. None of all of the raw meat survived the surgery. All the cooked meat ones died. Right. So they're like, whoa, okay, hold on. So then they completely switched gears and went like, okay, this is more interesting. Is there a difference between the nutritional content of cooked meat versus raw meat? And are we losing something by cooking it? And so they found that the cooked meat cats were not as healthy and robust. The raw meat cats were extremely healthy, big, strong, well-developed, cheekbones and brain, and very, very active, very physically active, playing a lot, sexually, expressing, normal sexual desires and procreating and having kittens and all that sort of stuff. The cooked meat cats were less so. They were less healthy. They were more prone to getting sick. They had, lower, litters. They weren't as reproductively fit. The next generation was a lot worse. The next generation was less developed. They didn't have as well developed zygomatic arches, cheekbones. They didn't have as well developed brains. They were smaller, and their bodies were smaller. They were, like 30% smaller than the other cats, right? And their bone mineral density was worse. I think it went from like 14% down to 7%, right? So they had more fractures. They were less interested in sex. They were less interested in play. They were more subdued. The third generation was even worse. These was really sad. These cats were just crippled, and their bone mineral density, their brains were even smaller. Their zygomatic arches were even less developed. Their bodies were smaller, and their bone mineral density, I think, went down to like 3%, 4%. And they said that the bone consistency was that of foam rubber. They weren't strong. And so they had one cat that had something like over 30 fractures all throughout his body. He could just barely walk. They were crippled. It was really, really sad actually to hear about this. And they couldn't reproduce at all. They couldn't make it. They couldn't make a fourth generation, right? So that's just losing out on, taurine, which you lose from cooking, and probably a few other sorts of things. And that was it. The cats require taurine, and that was it. They weren't getting enough, and it just didn't work. It didn't work for them. They couldn't grow good cats, and it screwed up their entire physiology. And they eventually started giving that third generation raw meat, and their health improved, and they were able to reproduce. And so like, okay, well, let's see what these kittens are like. And they should be back to raw meat, the raw meat variety. Raw meat stayed good every generation, right? And no, unfortunately, it took 4 generations to breed back to what the raw meat cohort was doing, right? And so they had the big brain. Bigger cats don't have big brains, but big brain for a cat, and the developed cheekbones and body size and mineral density in their bones and all these other sorts of things, and they weren't getting sick and they weren't having problems. Funny enough, too, after that, they had these sort of dirt patches, sandy sort of things that they were living on, and they were peeing and defecating in the sort of the sand that they were living in, and or dirt or whatever, and they sort of left these things alone, and they're sort of exposed to air and all that sort of stuff and sunlight. And weeds started getting in, grasses started getting in, seeds started getting in. And in the areas where the cats were fed raw meat, it was just weeds just growing like crazy. There's just all these plants just going nuts. And in the other ones, like, the second gen, in the cooked meat cats, there was less. And in the second gen, there was even less. And like in the ones, there was like the third gen, and there was just even condensed milk and, and like third gen sort of things. It was like, there was nothing grew, so it was quite interesting, how that has an effect down the ecological ladder. But yeah, so, we know that matters, and so if we had the Inuit and they were missing out on just one amino acid, or just one vitamin just wasn't quite enough, one little phytonutrient wasn't quite getting there, they would die out, right? Probably in short order. And all of our ancestors throughout the ice ages would have died out. All the Native Americans that almost exclusively ate buffalo, maybe they had some berries here and there, but a lot of them didn't, and the native Australians as well. Same thing. If they had access to meat, they ate meat. And the explorers since the 1600s were talking about this. I have a book on some Belgium explorers that came in. They were talking about this. There's a whole chapter on diet. They're just marveling. These guys would only eat meat. They wouldn't eat anything else. Tried giving them even fish that they had caught. And they're like, yeah, we don't want it. We want our meat. We want our mussels and abalone that we get. We don't want that crap. And so they're very picky on what they ate. And missionaries and things like that were living with the Aboriginals, since the 16, 17, and 1800s, they would remark on this. They were like, we try to give them bread and all these things. They didn't want it. They wanted nothing to do with it. They knew which plants to use medicinally, and they knew which plants they could survive on if they had to get through a rough patch, if they couldn't get killed. But as soon as they got meat, that was it. That's what they ate. And so, you can't do that generation after generation after generation unless meat has everything that you need. And what was there to eat, during the ice ages besides meat? Really wasn't anything. What were people eating when they were migrating across the land bridge from Asia to North America in the last ice age? It's not going to be any fruit or tubers or leafy greens or berries, because it was deep in an ice age. It was, in the Arctic Circle in an ice age. This was, they were walking through what is now ocean, because it was just completely just blocked in ice, and they were eating meat. They were eating seals and mammoths and whatever they were eating. It was animal based. You cannot do that unless you get everything that you need. And like Pottinger's cats, you're going to get worse, and you're going to get sicker, and generation after generation, you're going to get smaller and more feeble. You can't do that in an ice age. You either thrive or you die. There's no eking your way through an ice age. Nothing ekes its way through. Nothing barely makes it through an ice. Everything barely makes it through an ice age. And the ones that make it through an ice age are the ones that thrived. We did not only thrive, we dominated. We dominated every other animal on every other continent besides Antarctica. I don't think we were down there. And that is a testament to how healthy we were. And we're much taller too. The Native Americans in the plains that were just eating buffalo, they were just carnivores, right? They just ate fatty meat, buffalo, the whole year round. They would chase a herd of buffalo over a cliff. They'd fall, crash, and burn, and they would harvest the meat, dry it out, mix it with rendered fat, make pemmican, right? And that's what they'd eat for the rest of the year. And maybe they'd hunt and get some fresh game here and there, but largely what they ate was pemmican. And they were there's a study that actually showed that they were the tallest human beings on Earth at that time, right? These guys were like pushing 7 feet tall. They were huge. There's actually a delegation that came to meet then President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was like 6'2", he's a tall guy, right? And he said in his writings that these guys were giants, that they were huge. They were massive, massive, massive people. And they have paintings of them at the time, and they actually put that into proportion. They said like, oh, look at these guys. They have these tiny heads. Look at that, these idiot savages. They just have small brains. And they're like, no, they actually had big ass heads, and you put it in proportion, and they were like, oh, okay. Not only do they have big heads, but they just had massive bodies. So they actually looked at that, and they estimated they were nearly 7 feet tall, right? And just these massive, lean, strong, muscular warriors just ate a ton of beef every day, and that's it.
Fascinating.
So, if you don't get everything you need in the proportion you need it, you can't do that.
I want to go back to Pottinger's cats. I actually recently read a long thread someone had posted about this on Twitter. Obviously, what it shows is that, cats thrived on species-appropriate diet, because, of course, cat in the wild isn't going to start fire and cook the meat, right? They're used to eating raw meat. Now, how does that translate to us humans? I really want to put your thoughts on sort of raw meat, and, oh no, you can't do carnivore, you can't thrive if you're cooking your meat as humans, because we have had the ability to cook meat. If you go back to our evolutionary past. So what are your thoughts on it? Because there's no way I'm eating raw meat, by the way. I'm happy enough to have transitioned to carnivore, but there's no way I'm eating raw meat.
Yeah. So no, I don't think you have to do that. I mean, yes, you do lose some nutrients, but you actually make others more bioavailable, and so that could be a benefit. Again, you look back on what people have done, and there is actually quite good evidence that humans have been eating, and humans and earlier humans have been eating cooked meat for at least 800,000 years, right? So that's 500,000 years, 500,000 years before Homo sapiens even existed, right? And there was evidence actually that they were using ovens back then, right? So using like this some sort of covering and cooking here, so that you had this like pizza oven sort of effect where you had this even distribution of heat throughout, right? It wasn't just people just throwing bones in the fire or something like that. No, there was actually like this uniform heat throughout. That was 800,000 years ago. right? And there's thoughts, people are postulating that it probably goes back longer than that, to like 1.5 million years or even 2 million years, when the ice ages came down. And Dr. Bill Schindler is a retired professor of paleoanthropology and archaeology at the University of Maryland. I spoke with him, and he thinks it's probably closer to 2 million years, for the simple reason that when the ice sheet started coming down around 2 million years, 2+ million years ago, you know, people weren't running away from that towards the equator. They actually ran into it and attacked into the ice age, attacked into the ice shelves, because that's where, presumably where the megafauna was, and that's what they were hunting. That's what they wanted. It's hard to do that when you don't have fire, as I should say. They didn't want fiber. They wanted mammoth. And so, but if you don't have fire, it's quite hard to survive an ice age. Now you can get furs and do all these sorts of things, but fire helps. Fire is great. But you don't, you know, we've had cooked meat at least 800,000 years, right? So before Homo sapiens existed, their ancestors, our ancestors, were cooking meat. And so we're well adapted. Whatever we lose in cooked meat is accounted for, because we've adapted for it. We've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, so we've adapted. And so I don't have too much problem with cooking meat. I just naturally go with taste, and tastes better when it's less cooked, like medium rare or even rare. I sort of sear the outside of things now and then just eat it. I like that taste. When you cook a rare steak, the inside is raw. That's what raw meat tastes like. It's actually pretty good, and so, I don't mind it. Sashimi, steak tartare, other sorts of delicacies, just any cured meat, that's all raw as well. I think that it probably gave us an advantage, because when you cook meat, it's going to kill the parasites, right? And when you're eating wild game, there are parasites, and so that can help with survival as well. And so it probably gave us, I think that it probably would have given us a survival advantage to cook meat as well.